This is our third session on understanding the menstrual cycle. And in our last session, we understood what follicular phase usually is and what are the different changes that are taking place during the uterine cycle. So let us just now we'll look into the details of the events that take place during the follicular phase. And in order to do that, let us just what are we trying to understand? We are trying to look at these particular events, the first 14 days changes that are taking place in the ovary as well as in the uterus. So we are looking at the let us look at the changes that are taking place in the ovary. So first of all, let us look at the ovary of a fetus. Now inside the ovary of the fetus, all you can see, even if you magnify it, you can see these tiny little structures which are called primordial follicles. And what is inside a primordial follicle is something that we'll see in just a little while. So this is the ovary of the fetus, which just has primordial follicles. But if you look at the ovary of an adult, a post-pubertal female, we'll see a lot of structure. We'll see primordial follicles, we will see primary follicles, we will have a look at, you can also see secondary follicles, and then we can look at the vesicular follicles, but the common name is Graphene follicle, very important, Graphene follicle. And then what we see in the ovary of a post-pubertal, after puberty has been achieved, post-pubertal female, is also we see ovulation, right? So now let us have a look at how these changes basically start. Now follicular phase ranges from the first basically spans the first 14 days. Now what is, let us see what happens during day 0. Now imagine that the female has just achieved puberty today, exactly at this day. So just at this particular day, if you remember from our previous sessions, the ovary of the female has primordial follicles only, right? She only has the primary oocytes, which are diploid and which have undergone meiosis but have been frozen in prophase 1. And because they've been frozen at prophase 1, they are still diploid and they are still 4C, right? So I hope you remember what primordial follicles, the condition of primordial follicle is. Now at day 0, here we've got the primary oocyte. Where is that primary oocyte? That primary oocyte here, so when puberty is achieved, what are the hormones that are released? So we've got something called as GnRH. GnRH acts on the anterior pituitary, releases two hormones, the FSH and the LH. Now the FSH, this hormone that is secreted by the anterior pituitary, FSH, goes to the ovary. So here this particular hormone reaches the ovary, FSH. Now what does FSH do here? The FSH tells the cells in the cortical region to form specialized cells around the primary oocyte. So here let us look at this particular image. So this is what happens. So we've got the primary oocyte, you see here in the center, and around it a layer of cells begins to form, and these are called follicular cells. Now these are called primordial follicles, and bear in mind that primordial follicles are formed in the fetal stage, right? So now this is post-pubertal event that I'm talking about. So due to and why are these primordial follicles formed in the first place? Why do we have follicular cells in the fetus? It is because some amount of GnRH is still released in the fetus even before puberty also. But after puberty, when huge amounts of GnRH is released, a lot of FSH is also released. And this FSH, what it does is, this primordial follicle, this structure here, these structures here are then converted into something called as a primary follicle. Now bear in mind that the primordial follicle has primary oocyte, which is frozen in prophase 1 of meiosis 1. Bear this in mind. Now there is no change happening there at the moment. So now once FSH is released, the primordial follicles, here this primordial follicle, you can see the single layer of cells around. These are all follicular cells, but there is only a single layer of flat thin cells. Now FSH causes them to grow, and what happens is this. So you see now those cells are gone, and they are replaced by these columnar cells, cuboidal cells. They are like cubes, and there are like 2 or 3 layers of these cells, right? And now these follicular cells that have grown due to the due to the effect of follicular stimulating hormone on the ovary, now these particular layer of cell is called the zona granulosa, or the zone of granular cells, zona granulosa. And on the inside, what do we have? We have got this oocyte. So this is the oocyte, primary oocyte, yet not divided. And around this primary oocyte, these granulosa cells, what do? They secrete a protein layer on the inside, and this protein layer is called zona pellucida. Now at this stage, from the moment, see, initially there were primordial follicles. Even after, just before puberty had reached, was achieved, there still were primary oocytes frozen in prophase 1. But FSH does what? Makes more follicular cells. It adds up something called as the zona pellucida, and one very important thing, interesting happens. The primary oocytes which are frozen in prophase 1, they now move through prophase 1 up till metaphase, anaphase, telophase 1, and meiosis 1 is completed. So meiosis 1 is accomplished, and at this stage now, what do we have? We have a primary follicle. We had a primordial follicle, but now we have a primary follicle. Now how does a primary follicle differ from a primordial follicle? Number one, it has columnar granulosa cells, your follicular cells, columnar follicular cells. If you don't remember this, at least you should remember it has many layers. Primary follicle has many layers of follicular cells. It also has zona pellucida, which is a layer of protein secreted by these cells to the inside. And then what type of oocyte we have? We have now a secondary oocyte. Why? Because the meiosis 1 event is over, and somewhere here we will also have a polar body, which is not shown here, but I'm just drawing it here. So we'll also have the first polar body. Now is there something else that we are forgetting? No. So the hormones, luteinizing hormone and FSH, have done this here. Now at this moment, let us look at the graph here for the hormones. So the hormones that have been secreted are, so here in this, the blue line is the luteinizing hormone that has been secreted by the brain. Follicle stimulating hormone has also been secreted, but you see here the concentrations are still pretty much low, and this, even this lower amount of concentration which is stimulated by GnRH, is sufficient to bring a change in the primordial follicle, and a primordial follicle is converted into a primary follicle. Now remember, oocyte resides inside a follicle. Okay, what are the other events taking place in the ovary? Are there any changes in the other hormones, ovarian hormones? So we've seen the hormones from the brain. There was a rise which caused these changes. Okay, the FSH caused this change, but there is no change in the ovarian hormones. So here we have, in purple we got progesterone, in the orange we got estradiol or estrogen. So the concentration of estrogen and progesterone remains low. Now we've seen what is happening here in the ovary. We understood primordial follicle is converted into primary follicle. The primary oocyte has been converted into secondary oocyte and a polar body. The hormones LH and FSH have slightly increased, but that amount is sufficient enough to cause follicular formation, cells of follicles. The concentration of estrogen, not estradiol, we won't remember it as estradiol, estrogen and progesterone remains low. Now let us look at what is happening in the uterus. Inside the uterus, you see here it shows a degradation or rupturing of the endometrium. This tells us that low estrogen and progesterone concentration in the produced by the ovary or in the body causes menstruation or menses. So endometrial lining is rupturing. Let us look at the next event. What happens next? What is happening next is, so we got the primary follicle and Give me a moment. Ha. So uh, we've just finished this. Meiosis 1 has been completed. We've got the secondary oocyte, first polar body. Granulosa cells have been added. Zona pellucida has been formed. The hormone LS, luteinizing hormone for follicular stimulating hormones have been released, which are making these follicular cells. Zona pellucida has been formed because of FSH, and there is low concentration of estrogen in the body and progesterone, because of which endometrial lining or menstruation is taking place. So we can see during the first 7 days what is happening are these events. Now we move to the next stage. Now what happens in the next stage is, because there is still follicular stimulating hormone still present there, so under the influence of FSH, because there is still a higher concentration of FSH, more follicular cells are developed. Let's have a look at now. See now how this structure has increased in size. The oocyte is in the center. Outside the oocyte, here in the pink margin, we got zona pellucida, the layer of proteins which separates the granulosa cells or the follicular cells from the oocyte. And here we got in the primary follicle, we only had 2 or 3 layers of these granulosa cells. But now you see the number of layers has increased immensely. These must be like 15 to 20 layers of granulosa cells. So the next change, the next stage in the follicular phase is here. Now we are somewhere beyond the 7th day or the 8th day. Now Meiosis 2 starts. If you remember the oocyte here, what oocyte do we have? We have got the secondary oocyte, and we also have the first polar body. What is the ploidy of the secondary oocyte? If you remember, it is haploid. Or what is the amount of DNA? It is 2C, right? So this is the condition, and the secondary oocyte now starts with, and this was the result of meiosis 1. Now it starts to undergo meiosis 2, and if you remember from your previous classes, this stage will be frozen. Now meiosis 2 starts but is arrested at metaphase 2 here. So this is the next stage. Follicular stimulating hormone is still being produced by the brain. See, now its concentration is rising slightly. FSH is rising slightly. Because of this rise in FSH, more granulosa cells are added, and that's why we see this follicle is growing in size. Now the zona pellucida also thickens. This layer zona pellucida, compared to the primary follicle, see, primary follicle has it. Primordial follicle does not have any zona pellucida, single layer of cell, right? But compared to the primary follicle, this is the primary follicle, secondary follicle that is now being formed has a thicker layer of zona pellucida. This is the next stage, formation of the secondary follicle. Now zona pellucida is further thickening up. There are a large number of granulosa cells. Now a layer of cell on the outside is also formed. A new layer is formed now in secondary follicle. In the next stage, what is happening? There is this layer of cell, you see, spanning here. This particular, not this, let me just rub it and redo it. So the layer of cell that we am talking about is this layer of cell here, this layer of cell here. You see, a layer of cell is being added outside the zona granulosa. So this is the zone of the granular cells, zona granulosa. All of this is the zona granulosa. So outside the layer of, or the zone of zona granulosa or the granulosa cells, a single layer of cell is added, and this is called the theca cell. This is called the theca. You don't have to remember it as theca interna, just remember it as theca. So secondary follicle shows the formation of theca. Now both the cells of the theca here and the cells of the zona granulosa, both of these cells together, they produce hormones. They start to produce hormones inside this secondary follicle, this whole structure of the secondary follicle. And those hormones that these cells are now making together, what are those three hormones? Those 3 hormones that are being now produced are estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. So now these cells start to produce estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. Let me use a green marker. So you see this, and this. So secondary follicle produces these 3 hormones, and now because they are in the liquid state, and these hormones will start to accumulate in tiny little pools. They'll start making pools around. Sometimes they make a large number of pools, but in this particular image we see that one pool has been made here. You see this pool here, see this empty space here. So this space now is called antrum. Secondary follicle can be identified by the presence of antrum, by the presence of large number of granulosa cells, and by the presence of a layer of cell called theca. So these three are the characteristics of secondary follicle. And what is making them? The follicle stimulating hormone from the brain, its concentration has increased, and it is because of those the granulosa cells have also increased now. Now the antrum is full of these three hormones, and this process is going to continue. And what kind of an oocyte we have? I hope you remember, we have got now the secondary oocyte, which is arrested in metaphase 2 of meiosis 2. So we still have only two cells, a secondary oocyte and a polar body. We only have two. So let's draw a polar body somewhere here, right? Not outside. We should draw it on the inside of the. We should draw it on the inside of the zona pellucida. Let's draw it here. So it is somewhere here, the polar body, and the oocyte is somewhere here, right? Now these are the changes that are taking place in the ovary. So we have reached here, right? We have reached here somewhere next to 7 to 9 days period or 10 days period. We have reached here. So this is the secondary follicle, right? Now what are the changes that are taking place in the ovary? You see, now the menstrual cycle, the menstruation or the degradation of the uterine lining comes to an end. It stops. Why does it stop? Because now there is some estrogen and progesterone being produced. The cells that have produced the estrogen and progesterone, which are the theca and the cells of the zona granulosa, this estrogen and progesterone that is now inside, some of that estrogen and progesterone is also released into the neighboring tissue, and it is going into the blood. From the blood it is transferred, it has moved to the uterus, where these hormones are now telling the uterus to make new or fresh uterine lining or endometrium. And so from here, from the menstrual phase, the uterus moves to the proliferative phase. It moves into the proliferative phase, right? Now let us look at the next stage. What happens next? Now the secondary follicle will keep on continuing. It will continue to grow. Let us first of all go back, look at the ovary and see where we have reached. So we were at primordial follicle, single layer of granulosa cells. Then after puberty, FSH was released. FSH allowed the primary follicles to grow in size, and here we got primary follicles. Primary follicles still have the primary oocyte, which starts to undergo meiosis 1, and then these primary follicles will start to grow more granulosa cells. Eventually they are converted into secondary follicles, the one that we just saw. And you see here we got two antrums. In the diagram that we saw, we just had one. It is normal. Eventually both of these antrums will fuse, they will form a larger antrum. Now what is the next stage? Now by the way, what is inside the secondary follicle? Just as a mark of revision, we have secondary oocyte, and we also have the first polar body. Now what happens next is that the antrum, let's go down. So now there's the secondary follicle. What happens next is now the antrum. You see, this is still this one here is a secondary polar body, is a secondary follicle, and we got these different antrums. Eventually these antrums will fuse together. You see here in this big structure here, now this large structure here is called a Graphene follicle. This is the final stage of follicle, or the ultimate development, the final developed stage of the follicle. The follicle does not grow beyond it. This is the ultimate stage. Now what do we see here in this Graphene follicle? What do we see? All the antrum. See, the antrum has become massive, it has become huge. And the oocyte, now here is the oocyte, this is the oocyte, okay, only the central part, this oocyte, and here we've got the polar body. Okay, let's do it once again neatly. So where is the oocyte? Let me use a yellow marker. So this here is the oocyte here in yellow, and somewhere here is the polar body on the inside. Let's use a red to show the polar body. So let us say we have the polar body somewhere here. Now what kind of an oocyte this is? This is still a secondary oocyte, and this is the first polar body. What change has taken place in the secondary follicle? The secondary follicle, the antrum of the secondary follicle has increased massively. Why? Because the granulosa cells, if you remember, these cells, the zona granulosa and the theca cells, which have not been shown here, but the theca cells are lying just at the border. So here these are the theca cells. Both of them together have made up a lot of hormones, the three hormones, if you remember, the estrogen, progesterone and inhibin, and those hormones have now flooded the antrum. and the oocyte, the secondary oocyte first polar body, and here around them we got the zona pellucida, the protein layer, and around them a few granulosa cells are still attached, and this structure here has been separated. It is floating like an island inside the follicle, and this stage is called the Graphene Follicle. And how is it characterized? By large antrum, which is made due to the fusion of smaller antrums. We got the secondary follicle surrounded by zona pellucida, few layer of granulosa cells, right? And now these cells here, they are no more called granulosa cells. If you see, can you see it appears like a sun and the radiations of the sun? So now these layers of cell are now called corona radiata. Corona radiata on the inside has zona pellucida. We got a secondary oocyte, we got a polar body, and then we got an antrum, and then we got these granulosa cells on the outside, zona granulosa, and then theca cells. So this is what the graphene follicle is, and we have reached here now. We are at this particular stage now. And what is happening at this stage? See, this stage is exactly before 14 days. This stage can range from anywhere from 9 to 14 days. Okay, so in some cases it can be a little early, it can be 8, in some cases it can be 10, or it can be 12, right? So usually it is from between 9 to 14 days that the graphene follicle is formed. Now what changes are taking place? So these are the changes that have taken place in the ovary. What are the changes that have taken place in the uterus? The uterus is now, because the concentration of estrogen is extremely high. You see the three hormones, the antrum is full of them, and these hormones are now leaking into this space in the ovary, outside the ovary, into the bloodstream. Let us just go back. Let me show you one of the slides and I'll tell you exactly what is happening. So you see the hormones are seeping in, right, from these places, and where are they going into? They are going to the blood, and the blood is carrying them to all the parts of the body, including the uterus. And so now in the graphene follicle stage, there is a very high estrogen content in the blood due to secondary and graphene follicle, due to these follicles and due to these follicles. Because of this high estrogen content, what is the function of estrogen? Always remember, estrogen and progesterone both will make the endometrium lining. So now proliferative phase speeds up. There is a massive proliferation of endometrial lining. It thickens heavily. Now also what happens at this particular time is, usually estrogen has a negative feedback on the pituitary gland. So let us say we have the pituitary gland. So when the concentration of estrogen increases, now this is very interesting to remember. So estrogen helps to build the uterine lining, but high concentration of estrogen acts on the anterior pituitary and tells it to stop making LH, luteinizing hormone, and follicular stimulating hormone. Why? Because now the graphene follicle is ready. One egg is ready. Why to make more eggs? Why to make more follicles? So the estrogen tells the brain to stop making FSH and reduce the amount of LH. Okay, it primarily tells the brain to reduce the production of FSH and also LH, but greatly FSH. So FSH, the production of FSH goes down extremely low, and sometimes it might even stop. I'm not too sure, but it goes down too low, and because of that, no more follicles are formed. No more follicles. So you see all of these primary, secondary, tertiary follicles. So now no more follicles are being formed because the ovary is not receiving any more FSH, right? So here in the pituitary is the graphene follicle tells ki aisa mat karo, right? But now what happens, and this is really strange, this is the function of estrogen throughout. Secondary, the moment the secondary follicle is formed, the moment these hormones start to form, the brain is always told ki that don't produce FSH, don't make any more follicles, so that we do not need any more eggs to be formed at the moment. Let one or couple of eggs be formed, right? Now just before the 14th day, 24 hours to 36 hours before the 14th day, before the egg has to be released out of the ovary, before this secondary oocyte has to be released out of the ovary, just this much time before, just around 24 hours before, the anterior pituitary starts behaving differently. Anterior pituitary, when estrogen is received by anterior pituitary, it stops the production of FSH. But just 24 to 36 hours before, the pituitary changes its own behavior. What it does is, this time, if estrogen is provided to it, if 24 hours or 36 hours before ovulation, before the 14th day, estrogen is estrogen reaches the anterior pituitary, it behaves exactly oppositely. What it does is, anterior pituitary starts secreting extremely huge amounts of luteinizing hormone and some amounts of FSH. Some amount. It still will not secrete a lot of FSH, but what it does is, estrogen tells the pituitary, the anterior pituitary changes its behavior. It reads the presence of estrogen as a signal to release huge amounts of LH. Before the 14th day, if the anterior pituitary was provided estrogen, it will produce less of luteinizing hormone and FSH. But just 24-36 hours before, its behavior changes for unknown reasons. I just read a latest text and it says for unknown reason its behavior changes, and its behavior changes such that now the concentration of luteinizing hormone suddenly increases. Now here, we'll just take a little break for a little while and we'll see what happens because of this. So let us go back. So I hope the formation of graphene follicle is clear to you so far. What is happening because of graphene follicle? What is happening to the hormones? See, we still have low luteinizing hormones, but here this is the 24 to 36 hours period. Let me just clear this up here. So if you see, this is the 14th day here, and this, what happens just 24 to 36 hours before. You see, in the blue we have got luteinizing hormone. There is a sudden increase in luteinizing hormone. Why? Because the follicle, the secondary follicle in the graphene follicle, has increased the amount of estrogen in the blood. You see, there's so much of estrogen. As the amount of estrogen increases hugely, what it does to the anterior pituitary, it tells the anterior pituitary, because it starts behaving differently, the anterior pituitary, as a response to estrogen, starts producing a lot of LH. And you see, that is the reason why we have this peak of LH here. Let me rub this all and let me allow you to see this once again. So at the beginning, if you see, when the estrogen was increasing, the amount of luteinizing hormone was just decreasing. Okay, it was just decreasing, it wasn't increasing as the amount of estrogen was increasing. Why? Because anterior pituitary takes a negative feedback of estrogen. Estrogen 24 to 36 hours before the 14th day, the estrogen is taken as a signal from the ovary by the anterior pituitary to not produce LH and FSH. But exactly 24 to 36 hours before the 14th day, the anterior pituitary behaves exactly oppositely. What it does is, as this time period approaches, as more and more estrogen is being produced, who's producing estrogen? The graphene follicle and the secondary follicle. There is a massive surge, this is called surge, increase in luteinizing hormone, and there is also a slight increase in the follicle stimulating hormone, slight, not much, okay, because this is how the pituitary behaves. So due to this excessive release of luteinizing hormone, there is this great change that takes place in the ovary. The luteinizing hormone now that is released by the brain reaches the ovary. Let us rub all of this. The excess luteinizing hormone that is now released by the brain reaches the ovary and reaches the graphene follicle, and it tells the graphene follicle to rupture. And now the graphene follicle actually ruptures. This wall breaks. This wall breaks. Here, have a look here also, here. So this is the graphene follicle, and this wall breaks, and the structure on the inside, which is basically the secondary oocyte and the first polar body, the zona pellucida and corona radiata, this entire structure moves out of the ovary here. And let's just draw it. So we got the corona radiata cells, we got these corona radiata cells on the outside, and then we got the zona pellucida in blue, and then we got the secondary oocyte in green here, and then we got a polar body somewhere here. So this entire structure is now released, and this process, this stage, is called ovulation. And when does this happen? It happens on the 14th day. Now in our next session, we will move on to the luteal phase, and we will also see what happens during the luteal phase, both in the ovary and in the uterus. So far what we've understood is we've understood the follicular phase of the ovary, and we have understood the menstrual phase and the proliferative phase of the uterus, inside the uterus. I'll see you in the next session. Thank you.